Have you ever wondered what lies in the shadows of small towns? Places where everyone knows your name, and secrets are supposed to stay hidden? But what if the secrets are darker than we ever imagined? In the quiet corners of these forgotten towns, strange things are happening. Unexplained events, whispers in the wind, shadows that move when no one is there. These aren't just ghost stories, these are real accounts from people who've lived through them. But why here? Why in these places, far removed from the chaos of the big cities? Could it be that these small towns, with their old buildings and silent streets, are perfect breeding grounds for something darker? Take the story of Elijah, the prophet of Gilead. He appeared out of nowhere, a man of immense strength, challenging the king himself, announcing a drought that would bring a nation to its knees. What gave him such power? Was it divine intervention, or was there something more, something lurking beneath the surface of these lands, feeding off the fear, the despair? And here's a thought: why do these events feel different from the ones we hear about in bustling cities? Is it because in small towns, the darkness has more room to grow, to fester, unnoticed by the masses? Or is it that the very fabric of these places holds on to something ancient and unseen? What if the energy here, steeped in years of untold stories and forgotten sins, draws out the supernatural, the unexplainable? So, we ask ourselves, are these manifestations simply the echoes of a troubled past, or is there something more sinister at play? What do you believe? In the heart of Mexico's Aguascalientes region, far from the bustling cities and the rush of modern life, there lies a small, forgotten village, Tapias Viejas. It's the kind of place where the air is thick with history, and the old stone houses seem to whisper stories of the past. But not all those stories are meant to be told. Cesar Gutierrez knows this all too well. He wasn't a man given to superstition or ghost stories. No, Cesar was practical, a man who worked with his hands, who lived by the rhythms of the land and the animals he cared for. But what he experienced in Tapias Viejas would shake even the most grounded of souls. It was an ordinary night, or so it seemed. Cesar had been hired to tend to the animals in a small, weather-beaten house on the outskirts of the village. This wasn't just any house, though. It had a presence, an atmosphere that was impossible to ignore. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land, Cesar went about his work, feeding the animals, making sure everything was in order. The night was calm, almost unnervingly so. The only sounds were the rustle of leaves and the occasional grunt from the pigs. And then, it began. At first, it was just a murmur, faint, indistinct, like the echo of a conversation just out of earshot. Cesar paused, listening, straining to catch the words. But the voices grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just one voice, it was several, overlapping, speaking in hushed tones as if a group of people were gathered inside the very walls of the house. The strange part? Cesar was alone. The only living beings with him were the pigs, huddled together in the corner of the dimly lit room. His heart raced as he stood there, rooted to the spot. Who were these voices? What were they saying? They seemed to rise and fall, their tone urgent, almost desperate. It was as if they were trying to communicate something, but Cesar couldn't make sense of it. He wasn't the type to scare easily, but this was different. It felt as though he had stepped into another world, a place where the rules of reality no longer applied. Summoning his courage, Cesar stepped inside the house, his footsteps echoing on the worn wooden floor. The voices didn't stop. In fact, they seemed to grow louder, more insistent, as if they were aware of his presence. He searched every corner, every shadowed nook, expecting, hoping, to find someone there, but there was nothing. Nothing except for the pigs, staring back at him with their small, dark eyes. They were calm, unaffected by the eerie atmosphere that hung over the room like a shroud. Perplexed and more than a little unnerved, Cesar decided to share what he had experienced with Don Chima, the owner of the house and the animals. Don Chima was an old man, weathered by years of hard work and life in this remote village. He was a man of few words, but the expression on his face when Cesar recounted the night's events spoke volumes. "You're not the first to hear them," Don Chima said quietly, his voice heavy with something Cesar couldn't quite place. "There's been talk, others have heard the voices too. But no one's ever seen anything." He paused, glancing toward the pen where the pigs were kept. "There's one pig in particular," he continued, "that I've always found strange. It's not like the others. I don't know how to explain it, but there's something about that animal that isn't right." Don Chima's words hung in the air, thick with implication. What did he mean by strange? Cesar pressed him for details, but the old man offered little more. It was as if he didn't want to say too much, as if acknowledging the strangeness would somehow give it power. Instead, he suggested that they remove the pig from the property, just to see if anything changed. 2 days later, the pig was gone. Don Chima had it moved to another location, far from Tapias Viejas. And with its departure, the voices ceased. The house, once filled with those unsettling murmurs, fell silent. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, leaving behind only the normal, everyday sounds of rural life. It was as if whatever had been there, whatever had been speaking through those walls, had left with the pig. But what was it about that pig? Why did its presence coincide with such strange phenomena? Was it simply an animal, or was there something more to it? Could it have been a vessel for something darker, something that had attached itself to the creature for reasons beyond human understanding? In the days that followed, Cesar couldn't shake the feeling that they had encountered something truly inexplicable. He tried to rationalize it, to find some logical explanation for what had happened, but every time he thought back to that night, to those voices, he was left with more questions than answers. The incident became a kind of legend in Tapias Viejas, a story that people would whisper about in hushed tones, never quite able to forget the night the voices filled the house. In the dense, rolling hills of Tamaulipas, Mexico, there lies a memory so chilling that it has remained etched in Ignacio Garza's mind for years. The Garza family had lived in these parts for generations, simple, hard-working people, familiar with the land and its secrets. But some secrets are darker than others, and not all of them can be buried. Ignacio was just a boy when it happened, full of energy and curiosity. He and his cousin often played together on a small hill not far from their home. It was their favorite spot, a place where they could run free and let their imaginations soar. The days were long and carefree, filled with laughter and the innocent games of childhood. But one day, something changed. It was late afternoon, the sun beginning its descent behind the hills, casting long shadows across the land. The boys were playing as usual, when suddenly, Ignacio felt a strange sensation, a chill in the air, a creeping unease that he couldn't quite shake. He glanced around and saw it, a figure standing on the edge of the hill, just beyond the trees. At first, he thought it was just a man, perhaps a traveler or a farmer, someone who had wandered too far from the path. But as he looked closer, something wasn't right. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, and it wore a wide-brimmed hat that cast a deep shadow over its face. The way it stood, still as a statue, sent a shiver down Ignacio's spine. Ignacio's cousin noticed the figure too, and both boys froze, unsure of what to do. The figure made no move toward them, but its presence was overwhelming, almost oppressive. It felt as though the very air around them had thickened, trapping them in place. Ignacio wanted to run, to get as far away as possible, but he couldn't move. His feet seemed rooted to the ground. Suddenly, they heard a voice, a deep, gravelly voice that they recognized immediately. It was Ignacio's grandfather, who had been working nearby. He called out to them, his tone sharp and commanding. "Get away from there," he shouted, striding up the hill with a speed and determination that belied his age. As their grandfather approached, the figure remained motionless, but the air grew colder still. Ignacio's grandfather stopped a few paces away from the figure, his eyes narrowing as he studied it. The boys could see the tension in his stance, the way his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "That's no man," he said, his voice low and steady, though laced with a hint of fear. He took a step closer, squinting as if to see through the shadow that obscured the figure's face. "It has horns," he murmured, almost to himself. "It's wearing a hat, but those are horns, not a head." Ignacio's heart pounded in his chest. Horns? His mind raced, trying to make sense of what his grandfather was saying. Was this some kind of animal? A trick of the light? But deep down, he knew that it was neither. Whatever stood before them was not of this world. Without another word, their grandfather grabbed the boys by the arms and pulled them away, hurrying them back down the hill as fast as their legs could carry them. Ignacio dared to glance back only once, and when he did, the figure was gone, vanished as if it had never been there at all. But the sense of dread lingered, clinging to them like a shadow. That night, the family gathered in their small home, the door locked tight, windows shuttered. No one spoke of what had happened, but the fear was palpable. Ignacio's grandfather paced the floor, deep in thought, his face lined with worry. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're leaving," he said. "We can't stay here any longer." And so, within days, the Garza family packed up their belongings and left their home, leaving behind the land they had known for generations. They never returned to that hill, and they never spoke of the figure again. It became a ghost of a memory, a story passed down in hushed tones, warning others of what lurked in the shadows of Tamaulipas. But what was that figure? Was it a demon, a spirit, or something else entirely? And why did it appear to Ignacio and his cousin on that fateful day? Some say it was a guardian of the land, angered by the presence of intruders. Others believe it was a dark omen, a sign of something far worse. But the truth remains a mystery, locked away in the minds of those who witnessed it. As you listen to this story, you might find yourself wondering, what would you have done if you had seen that figure? Would you have confronted it, like Ignacio's grandfather, or would you have run, leaving the mystery unsolved? In the end, some things are better left unexplored, left to fade into the mist of memory. Because in places like Tamaulipas, where the line between reality and the supernatural is thin, there are forces at work that we may never fully understand. In the quiet, mist-covered hills of Santiago, Colombia, a story circulates among the locals, one that sends a chill down the spine of anyone who hears it. This tale, recounted by Jose Aguirre, is not just a piece of folklore but a haunting memory shared by two men who lived through it, a memory that refuses to fade away. It was a day like any other when two neighbors, good friends who often enjoyed taking walks together, decided to venture up the cerro that overlooked their small town. The cerro was a place of solitude, a spot where one could find peace amidst the rustling leaves and the songs of distant birds. But on this day, peace was the last thing they would find. As the sun began to dip behind the mountains, casting long, eerie shadows across the landscape, the two men paused to take in the view. The air was cool, the silence comforting. But then, out of the corner of their eyes, they noticed something strange, a figure standing just a few meters away. It was a woman, or at least, it appeared to be. She was dressed in a simple, flowing gown, the kind that might have been worn in another era. But there was something terribly wrong about her. As the men strained their eyes in the dim light, they realized that the woman had no face. Where her features should have been, there was only a blank, smooth surface, as if someone had wiped away her identity. The men stared in disbelief, frozen in place by the sheer horror of what they were seeing. This was no ordinary encounter. This was something unnatural, something that didn't belong in their world. The first man, heart pounding in his chest, felt an overwhelming urge to flee. Without a word, he turned and ran, feet pounding the earth as he tore down the hill, driven by pure, unbridled fear. He didn't look back, didn't stop until he was safely home, breathless and shaking. But the second man wasn't so lucky. Paralyzed by the sight before him, he couldn't move, couldn't even scream. He was rooted to the spot, eyes locked on the faceless woman. The world around him seemed to blur, as if reality itself was slipping away. In that moment, he felt as though he was staring into the void, into something far beyond human understanding. When he finally managed to break free from his trance, the woman was gone, vanished as silently as she had appeared. But the damage was done. The man stumbled back home, his mind reeling, his body trembling. He couldn't shake the image of the faceless woman. It haunted his thoughts, invaded his dreams. In the days that followed, his health began to deteriorate. He was once a strong, vibrant man, but now, he was a shadow of his former self. His skin grew pale, his eyes sunken and hollow. He refused to leave his house, plagued by a deep, consuming fear that something was watching him, waiting for him. Then, the vision started. Late at night, when the world was quiet and still, he would see her, the faceless woman, standing outside his window. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at him with that blank, featureless face. He would wake in a cold sweat, heart racing, only to find the window empty. But he knew she had been there. He could feel her presence lingering in the room, like a cold breath on the back of his neck. The man's condition worsened, and soon, he was unable to sleep, too terrified of what he might see if he closed his eyes. His family tried to help, bringing in doctors and priests, but nothing seemed to work. The visions continued, relentless and unyielding, driving him to the brink of madness. What was this faceless woman? A ghost? A demon? Or something else entirely? Some in the town whispered that she was a lost soul, a spirit trapped between worlds, searching for something, or someone. Others believed she was a warning, a harbinger of doom sent to those who had strayed too far from the path of righteousness. But whatever she was, one thing was certain, she was not of this world. And she had chosen her victim, a man who would never again find peace, haunted by a faceless entity that refused to let him go. As you listen to this story, you might wonder, what would you do if you saw a faceless figure standing outside your window? Could you live with the knowledge that something so otherworldly had set its sights on you? Some mysteries are better left unsolved, some truths better left unspoken. For in places like Santiago, where the line between the living and the dead is thin, there are things that lurk in the shadows, things that defy explanation and challenge our understanding of reality. And once you've seen them, there's no turning back. In a small, remote town, nestled far away from the bustling lights of the city, there lies a forest so dense, so dark, that even the bravest of souls dare not enter. The locals call it the Forbidden Forest. But why? What secrets does this mysterious woodland hide beneath its thick canopy of ancient trees? One night, a group of young adventurers, fueled by curiosity and a desire to prove the old tales wrong, decided to venture into this shadowy realm. They laughed off the warnings, the whispers of those who had seen, or heard, something in the depths of the woods. What could possibly go wrong? After all, it's just a forest, right? But as the night crept on, something changed. The air grew colder, the wind began to whisper strange, unintelligible words. Or were those even words? Perhaps they were the cries of something far more sinister, something that lurks between the trees, waiting, watching. What would you do if you suddenly realized you weren't alone? If the very darkness around you seemed to breathe, to pulsate with a life of its own? Panic set in as the young campers realized that they were being hunted, not by a wild animal, but by something they couldn't even describe. A smell, rotten, putrid, began to fill the air, and the shadows around them twisted and moved in unnatural ways. Every step they took seemed to echo with the sound of something, someone, following close behind. Can you imagine the terror of running through a forest, with no idea where to go, every tree looking the same, every direction feeling like a trap? And what if, despite your every effort, the thing chasing you only came closer, its presence growing stronger, more suffocating with each passing second. What happens when you're the last one left? When the screams of your friends have faded into silence, and all that remains is the sound of your own heartbeat pounding in your ears? Can you escape the grasp of the forbidden forest, or will its secrets consume you, like so many others before? And in the end, will you ever be the same? The House of Whispers. Setting: an old, abandoned mansion on the outskirts of a large city. For years, locals have spun dark tales about the house, once home to a wealthy family that mysteriously vanished overnight, leaving behind no clue of their fate. The mansion, now decaying and forgotten, is avoided by most, but its sinister reputation draws the curious and the brave. Story: driven by rumors of the house's dark history and haunted reputation, a group of 5 paranormal investigators decided to venture inside, hoping to capture compelling footage for a new documentary series. Armed with cameras, voice recorders, and thermal sensors, they entered the mansion just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the overgrown grounds. As soon as they crossed the threshold, the atmosphere shifted. The air inside was heavy, almost oppressive, with an unnatural chill that seemed to seep into their bones despite the warmth of the summer evening. The mansion's interior was a dismal sight. Peeling wallpaper hung in shreds, dust-covered furniture stood where it had been abandoned, and cobwebs draped across the ceiling like fragile curtains. The team split into pairs, carefully making their way through the grand, but decayed rooms. Almost immediately, subtle noises began to disrupt the silence: soft footsteps, the faint rustle of fabric, and then, unmistakably, the whispers. At first, the sounds were so quiet they could have been imagined. But as they pressed deeper into the house, the whispers grew louder and more distinct, though still impossible to understand. It was as if a chorus of unseen voices surrounded them, speaking in a language that no living person could comprehend. The Road of the Missing. Picture this: a long, desolate road, winding through a mountainous region, stretching endlessly into the dark. The locals call it the Road of the Missing. It's a place most people avoid after sunset, a stretch of highway notorious for swallowing travelers whole, never to be seen again. The road has no markers, no signs of civilization for miles. Only the occasional twisted tree and jagged cliffside serve as a grim reminder of its treacherous path. But what truly haunts this road is not just the isolation, it's the whispers of the lost, the countless stories of those who vanished without a trace. Truckers know it well. They talk about it in hushed tones at roadside diners and truck stops, sharing tales of strange encounters that make your skin crawl. Encounters with something otherworldly. One such story comes from a seasoned trucker, someone who had driven that road many times before without issue. But this night was different. It was the dead of night, the sky starless, the road bathed in the pale light of his headlights. He was alone, or so he thought. Somewhere in the middle of that dark, empty stretch of highway, he saw her. A woman, standing at the side of the road, her figure barely illuminated by the glow of his truck's lights. She was pale, too pale, like someone who hadn't seen daylight in years. Her eyes, well, they seemed to cut right through him. There was something unsettling about the way she looked at him, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Against his better judgment, he slowed down. After all, who would be out here, alone, in the middle of the night? And in that instant, the most inexplicable thing happened. He pulled over. Why do we do that? Why, even when every instinct in our body tells us to keep moving, do we stop? Is it curiosity? Compassion? Or something darker, something that draws us in despite our fears? He leaned over, opening the passenger door, and she climbed inside without a word. The silence between them was thick, almost suffocating. He stole a glance at her as he began to drive again. Her eyes never left the road, never blinked. She seemed oddly composed for someone hitchhiking in the middle of nowhere. And then, just when he thought the eerie quiet might drive him mad, she turned toward him. That's when he noticed it, her skin, her face. It was changing. Slowly, subtly at first, but undeniably transforming. Her pale complexion darkened, her features twisted and contorted, her eyes growing darker, more hollow. The flesh on her face began to sag, decaying before his very eyes, revealing a grotesque, almost skeletal form beneath. The stench of rot filled the truck cab, suffocating him, overwhelming his senses. And then came the sound, a low, guttural growl, like something inhuman, something not of this world. What would you do? Would you stop the truck? Would you slam on the brakes and try to run? Or would you freeze, paralyzed by fear, unable to comprehend what's happening right before you? He did the only thing his instincts told him. He swerved. The truck jerked violently to the side of the road, nearly crashing into the rocky mountainside. Heart pounding, he scrambled out of the cab, desperate for air, for escape. But when he turned to confront the thing in his truck, she was gone. No sign of her. No trace that she had ever been there. Only the lingering smell of death, faint but undeniable, remained in the air. You might think that was the end of it, that he drove away and never looked back. But here's the thing, he wasn't the first to see her, and he wouldn't be the last. Truckers driving through that same stretch of road have reported seeing her again and again, a figure standing by the roadside, waiting for her next ride. The questions linger, don't they? Who is she? What does she want? And why do some drivers stop, drawn to her like moths to a flame, while others pass by and live to tell the tale? But most chilling of all, what if the next time you find yourself on a dark, lonely highway, you see her too? The Forgotten Asylum. Imagine a crumbling, abandoned asylum, perched atop a hill overlooking a long-forgotten town. For decades, it stood silent, its once bustling halls now empty and decaying, swallowed by time and neglect. But this place, this forgotten asylum, hasn't been entirely abandoned. Some say it still holds the echoes of the tortured souls who were once confined within its walls. Others believe something far darker lingers there. On a cold, moonless night, a group of urban explorers decided to venture into the asylum. These adventurers, seeking thrills in the haunted and desolate, were no strangers to eerie places. They'd been in abandoned factories, shuttered hotels, and forgotten bunkers, but this asylum was different. It was said to be cursed, haunted by the ghosts of patients long dead. Locals refused to speak of it, and those who did only offered vague warnings to stay far away. But the warnings weren't enough to stop them. Armed with flashlights, cameras, and a sense of invincibility, the group made their way through the dense woods that surrounded the asylum. As they reached the rusted gates, the air grew heavy, filled with the kind of stillness that precedes a storm. There was something oppressive about the silence, like the entire asylum was holding its breath, waiting. When they stepped inside, the temperature seemed to drop instantly. The halls were dark, the faint glow of their flashlights barely penetrating the thick shadows that clung to every corner. Broken windows let in slivers of moonlight, casting strange shapes on the cracked walls and moldy floors. The silence was deafening, except for the occasional creak of rotting wood underfoot. But then, out of nowhere, the silence was shattered by a distant sound, faint but unmistakable. The sound of laughter. It echoed through the hallways, chilling and out of place, like the laughter of children playing hide and seek in a place where no one had played for years. The group exchanged uneasy glances but pressed on, their curiosity overpowering their fear. The laughter faded, replaced by another noise, screams. Echoing, distant, and unearthly, they seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Some were guttural, as if torn from throats raw with agony. Others were high-pitched, like the cries of someone pushed beyond the brink of sanity. And yet, despite the terror that gnawed at them, they continued deeper into the asylum. What were they hoping to find? A ghost? A thrill? Or maybe just a story to tell their friends?